The wind carried the scent of dust and lilacs across the open plains of Redstone Valley, a land where silence had weight and pride ran thicker than blood. The sun dipped low behind the hills, spilling gold over the fences of the Harland Ranch, the largest spread for 100 miles, owned by the richest man this side of the border. His name was Samuel Harland, a man whose wealth could buy anything but peace. And peace was the one thing he'd lost ever since his daughter turned 17. Clara Harland was known in every town between Redstone and Dry Creek, not for her beauty, though she had plenty, nor for her fortune, though she'd one day inherit it all. No, people spoke her name with a kind of fear. She was wild, untamed, and impossible to control. They said she'd broken a preacher's nose for calling her spoiled, that she'd galloped a stallion bareback into a thunderstorm just to prove a point. Her father had hired tutors, guards, even preachers to bring her into line, but each one left the ranch broken or humiliated. The last man, a retired lawman, had ridden off swearing she was possessed by the devil himself. And yet, beneath that fire, there was something else. Something even Clara didn't understand. A silence in her heart that no rebellion could fill. That evening, as the ranch hands worked the final herds into the corrals, Clara sat on the old windmill tower, looking out at the fading horizon. From that high perch, she could see the whole valley, from the cottonwoods by the creek to the church steeple in the far-off town. The same horizon she dreamed of escaping, but tonight, for reasons she couldn't name, she felt something watching her, something that wasn't the wind or the dying light. Down the dirt road, a lone rider was making his way toward Harland Ranch. His horse was black as coal, its hooves leaving small clouds of red dust behind. The rider's hat shadowed his face, but his back was straight, his pace steady, like a man who'd already seen too much of the world to be impressed by wealth or fear. He would arrive before sundown, and when he did, the story of Clara Harland, the untamable daughter of the valley's richest man, would change forever. Because this cowboy wasn't coming for money or glory, he was coming because of a promise, one made years ago under the dying breath of a friend. The windmill creaked. A hawk cried somewhere over the canyon. The ranch fell quiet. Something was about to shift in Redstone Valley, something that would test every heart, every soul, and every ounce of pride that land had left. And if you've ever known a person who seemed impossible to reach, someone whose pain ran too deep for words, this story might just remind you that sometimes even the hardest hearts can change when the right stranger rides in. So before we begin this tale of fire and redemption, take a second to leave a like and tell me in the comments if you've ever met someone who carried too much pride to be saved, because that's exactly where our story starts. Mornings on Harland Ranch began before the light had the courage to show itself. Lamps blinked on in the bunkhouse like a string of low stars. Coffee hissed on iron grates, and boots thumped the packed earth with a rhythm older than the town itself. Clara Harland was always awake before the first whistle, not because anyone told her to be, but because the quiet moments were the only ones that didn't feel like a cage. She'd slip out the side door of the big house with a slice of yesterday's bread and a tin cup of chicory, crossing the yard where the dust sat soft as flour. To anyone watching from a distance, she looked like a storm, waiting for a reason. Up close, you'd see the small things most folks didn't notice. The way she paused at the hitching post to rub the twitching ear of a nervous mule, the way she set her cup down carefully so as not to wake the old blue heeler sleeping by the steps, the way her eyes softened around animals in a way they never did around people. Her first stop was always the East Corral, where Vesper, a skittish roan mare, paced the rails with a fretful snort. The mare had belonged to Clara's mother, and some days Clara swore the horse remembered the gentler hands that once braided her mane. No ranch hand could get near Vesper without catching a kick. Clara never wore a bridle for her. She just stood still, palm open, waiting until the mare lowered her head and breathed into Clara's fingers. Good girl. she'd whisper, and for a minute the world would be quiet enough to hear dew sliding from the cottonwoods. After that came the rounds. She walked the fence line with a length of wire and a pocket knife, patching what needed patching. When a post leaned, she shouldered it upright and tamped the dirt with the heel of her boot. She preferred the company of wood and wind to the dull clatter of the dining room, where her father read the Redstone ledger like God had printed it himself. In that paper, men wrote long thoughts about law and order, and sometimes about Clara. "Harland heiress disrupts Sunday worship," one headline had smirked after she'd told the preacher a few truths about hypocrisy and power. She'd kept that issue, folded it into a small square, and tucked it under a floorboard beside a locket with her mother's hair. Most days, she avoided the house as long as she could. Samuel Harland expected reports by midday. Cattle counts, grain shipments, letters from bankers 3 states away. He'd sit at the head of the table, ringed by clerks and foremen, and speak as if his sentences were fences that could keep people inside them. He loved his daughter, in the way men who fear loss love anything. But he tried to protect her with money and rules, and she took to rules like a wild Mustang takes to a steel bit. The hands told stories about her at night. Some were true. Yes, she had ridden into a thunderstorm. She'd raced lightning across the ridge just to feel something louder than the arguments at home. Yes, she'd broken a preacher's nose. He'd grabbed a boy by the ear for fidgeting and called him the son of a drunk. And Clara couldn't abide a man who mistook cruelty for discipline, but there were other stories folks didn't tell because they didn't fit the legend. Like the way she left sacks of flour and dried apples at the widow Connolly's door without knocking. Or the quiet evenings in the bunkhouse where she taught Miguel, the cook's nephew, to read from her mother's Bible because the schoolteacher in town had looked at his brown skin and said, "Not today." Clara's flaws weren't secrets, but neither were her loyalties. She'd fight anyone for the defenseless, a stubborn, clumsy love that often came out sideways. The trouble was pride. It braided itself into her like a second spine. When her father arranged dinners with sons of railroad men, she attended with a smile that cut and words that made them wish they'd stayed home. When the sheriff warned her that wildness in a woman invited the wrong kind of attention, she tipped her hat and said, "Then the wrong kind of men should learn to mind their distance." Still, the emptiness followed. Nights found her on the windmill ladder, wind needling her hair, a small music box warming in her palm. It was her mother's, carved with tiny roses. She'd wind it and listen to the thin tune drift over the corrals. Some griefs never get smaller, you just grow around them. Clara had grown into barbs and thorns, sharp enough to keep people from pressing on the tender places. On the day the lone rider came, her routine didn't change much. She mended a stretch of fence by the north pasture and loosed a coyote from a trap the foreman had set too close to the creek. She didn't see the rider, not yet, but the ranch dogs lifted their heads at the same moment and stared toward the road. The air felt different, not bad, just braced, like the second before a match is struck. If anyone had asked Clara what she feared, she'd have laughed. But fear has many coats, and one of them looks like anger. By sundown, the lamps in the big house were lit, the clerks clicking pens, her father clearing his throat for the day's tally. She wiped her hands on a rag and stepped into the doorway, dust haloing around her boots. Somewhere beyond the cottonwoods, hoofbeats measured the distance between who she was and who she might become. The trouble started with thunder that wasn't from the sky. By mid-morning the horizon quivered, not with storm clouds, but with dust. A dozen riders came tearing across the south pasture, rifles glinting, coats black as crows. The ranch hands froze, cattle bawled and scattered, hooves drumming the hardpan like rain. Samuel Harland stepped out onto the porch, newspaper still in his hand, eyes narrowing to slits. Bandits weren't rare in Redstone Valley, but few were foolish enough to ride on Harland land. This gang, though, didn't come for cattle or cash. They came with a message. Their leader, a thick-shouldered man with a scar that dragged his mouth into a permanent sneer, rode straight to the porch and spat into the dirt. "Tell your men to stand down," he barked. "Ain't here to kill nobody unless they give me a reason." Clara had been near the barn, brushing Vesper's coat when the shouting began. She stepped into the sunlight, dust rising around her boots. The foreman motioned her back, but she didn't move. Something about the way the leader sat his horse, cocky, sure, cruel, made her blood go cold. Samuel folded his newspaper slow, like a man refusing to be rushed. "You've got a lot of nerve bringing guns onto my property," he said. The leader smirked. "Nerve's what it takes when a rich man don't pay what he owes." Clara blinked. Owes? Her father's jaw tightened. He'd done business with every ranch, bank, and outlaw outfit within 2 states, but none of them dared call him debtor. The man held up a crumpled letter. "Name's Royce Maddox. Your partner in the rail contract, before you sold him out. He's dead now. I'm collecting what he was promised." He pointed to the barn, to the corral, to the cattle that roamed the ridge. "Half of everything, or we take it." Samuel's voice went low. "You tell whoever sent you he's already got what he deserves." The words dropped like stones. Maddox's sneer faded. He leaned forward in his saddle. "Then I reckon we'll even the score another way." His gaze slid toward Clara. "You got a fine ranch here, mister. Shame if the girl had to watch it burn." Before anyone could move, Clara strode past the porch steps. "You'll do nothing of the sort," she snapped. "You want to settle debts. Settle them with the man who made 'em." The ranch hands whispered her name, pleading for silence. But Clara didn't know fear in the way most did. She planted herself between her father and the men, eyes bright as fire under her hat brim. Maddox laughed, a low, dirty sound. "Got yourself a wildcat, old man." He turned to his riders. "Torch the north field. Maybe then he'll see reason." What happened next blurred into chaos. The hired guns fanned out, kicking over feed barrels, firing shots into the air. The sky filled with the smell of gunpowder and trampled grass. Samuel shouted orders, his voice lost in the noise. The hands scrambled for rifles they hadn't used in years. Clara darted for Vesper's stall. The mare screamed and reared as flames leapt from a spilled lantern. Clara threw herself against the door, wrenching it open just as the fire reached the hay. Smoke stung her eyes. Behind her, a gunshot cracked, the sound of finality. When she looked back, her father was on one knee, clutching his shoulder. Blood soaked the white sleeve of his shirt. Maddox was gone, riding hard with his men, laughter trailing like smoke in the wind. By the time the flames were beaten down and the dust settled, half the pasture lay in ruin. The ranch doctor was already at work on Samuel, muttering that the bullet had missed his heart by a whisper. The foreman swore vengeance. The townsfolk would talk for months about the Harland attack, how the richest man in Redstone had been brought to his knees before noon. But all Clara could hear was her father's strained voice through the haze. "You see, girl, this is what pride costs. This land attracts wolves." He didn't know that one of those wolves had a conscience, or that he was already riding toward them, drawn by a promise and the echo of gunfire across the plains. Somewhere out there, beneath the same rising dust, a lonely cowboy heard the chaos and turned his horse toward Harland Ranch. He didn't know the girl's name yet, only that someone needed help, and he'd sworn long ago never to ignore a cry like that again. Smoke still curled above the north pasture when the doctor left the big house, his hands trembling from exhaustion. The sun was sinking now, red and heavy, smearing the sky like a wound that refused to close. Ranch hands stood in silence, hats pressed against their chests, their faces coated in soot and disbelief. The Harland Ranch, once untouchable, had been violated. Inside, Clara sat beside her father's bed. Samuel Harland's face looked pale beneath the lamplight, his once mighty hands now weak against the blood-stained sheets. He tried to speak, but the words came out broken, like the crack of an old fence post. Don't go after them, Clara," he said. "They'll kill you too." But Clara's eyes were distant. Her father's pain hit her like a hammer, but behind it burned something deeper. Shame, fury, helplessness. The kind that turned into steel if you didn't let it eat you alive. She stood up, her jaw set. They came for you, not me, but I'll be the one they remember, she said quietly. The doctor caught her wrist. You can't chase devils, girl. You'll just become one. She didn't answer. Outside, the air smelled of smoke and betrayal. She walked through the yard where the men whispered about leaving, about how the Harlan fortune wasn't worth dying for. Clara stopped near the well, where Vesper pawed the ground nervously. She pressed her forehead against the mare's neck, trying to slow her breath. They think I can't fix this, she murmured. They don't know me. The wind shifted. Somewhere down the road, the faint echo of hoofbeats approached, steady, unhurried, like time itself had chosen to walk back into her life. The dogs barked once, then went still. By the time the rider reached the gate, twilight had settled thick and violet over the valley. He dismounted without a word, patting the dust from his coat. His name was Eli Mercer, though no one at the ranch knew it yet. To them, he was just another drifter. Quiet eyes, weathered skin, and a way of moving that spoke of both weariness and purpose. "Who are you?" asked the foreman, stepping forward with a rifle half raised. Eli tipped his hat slightly. "Just passing through. Heard shots from the ridge." His voice carried the low calm of a man who'd seen worse. "You folks need help?" The foreman glanced toward the big house, then back at the stranger. "We've had all the help we can stand today." Before Eli could answer, Clara stepped out onto the porch. Her hair was tangled from smoke, her dress torn at the hem, but her posture was unbroken. For a second, neither of them spoke. Eli's gaze held something steady and unflinching, the kind of quiet that demands honesty. Clara felt it hit her like the first drop of rain after a drought. "My father's been shot," she said finally. "We don't need pity. We need justice." Eli nodded once. "Justice can be a hard word to carry." "I can carry it," she replied. The ranch hands watched from the shadows, whispering among themselves. Who was this stranger, this ghost of a man who showed up when the dust hadn't even settled? Eli walked to the corral, eyes scanning the burnt fences, the blackened soil. He knelt, rubbing a bit of ash between his fingers. "Whoever did this knew the land," he murmured. "Knew you'd be too proud to ask for help." Clara folded her arms. "Then maybe pride's all we've got left." He stood and met her gaze again. "No, you've got choice. Pride'll keep you standing, but it won't rebuild what's gone." She didn't want to admit it, but something in his voice, quiet, measured, honest, cut through the chaos she'd been drowning in. "Stay the night," the foreman muttered. "You can have the bunkhouse." Eli shook his head. "I'll sleep by the fire, easier to think under the stars." He turned back to Clara. "Tomorrow you'll tell me about them, the men who did this." Clara hesitated, then nodded once. For the first time that day, she felt a sliver of calm. Not peace exactly, but direction. As she walked back into the house, she looked once over her shoulder. The stranger sat by the flames, his silhouette framed against the dying light. There was something in that stillness, a promise maybe, that the story wasn't over yet, because sometimes the moment that breaks your world is the same one that sends help riding toward you. Morning rose slow over Redstone Valley, painting the ranch in pale gold and long shadows. Smoke still lingered in the air, a ghost of the fire that had tried to devour the Harlan name. Inside the main house, the sound of Clara's boots on the wooden floor echoed like a vow. She had slept little, if at all. Her father's fever had broken near dawn, and though the doctor claimed he would live, his words carried the weight of defeat. Outside, the stranger had already been awake for hours. Eli Mercer was a man who trusted silence more than talk. He'd stoked the embers, brewed coffee in a blackened tin pot, and watched the valley wake like he was reading a familiar book. Clara stepped out onto the porch, her arms crossed tight. "You're still here," she said. Eli looked up from the fire. "Sun wasn't done with me yet." She tried to sound firm, but fatigue softened her voice. "If you're after work, I can pay you fair. If you're after trouble—" He interrupted gently. "I'm after answers." He nodded toward the blackened fence posts. "You said those men came for a debt. I knew a man named Royce Maddox years ago. Rode with him during the border raids. He wasn't the kind to forgive betrayal. If he's gone, his boys are likely stirring up what's left of his bitterness." Clara's jaw tightened. "So you knew him?" "Knew him," Eli said, "and buried a few who didn't." For a moment the wind carried only the whisper of the prairie grass. Then, from beyond the ridge, came the faint echo of hooves, more than one set this time, but not the wild, reckless gallop of bandits. This rhythm was organized even. Familiar. Clara shaded her eyes and looked toward the horizon. "You expecting company?" Eli didn't answer at first. He stood, dusted off his hat, and stared toward the rising trail of dust. "Not expecting," he said, "but it seems word travels faster than I ride." Within minutes, 6 riders appeared cresting the ridge, silhouettes against the new sun. They wore dusters faded from years of weather, rifles slung low, eyes sharp. The kind of men who'd been through too much to talk big about it. They rode like wolves, patient, quiet, dangerous in a way that didn't need proving. Clara tensed. "Who are they?" "My past," Eli said, "or what's left of it." When the riders reached the yard, the one in front, a lean, grey-haired man with a scar cutting across his cheek, dismounted first. He looked at Eli and smiled faintly. "Heard you were out here chasing ghosts again, Mercer." "Not ghosts," Eli replied, "just debts that don't belong to the innocent." The grey-haired man glanced around the ranch. "Heard about the fire. You aim to settle it?" "That's the plan." The others exchanged glances, silent agreement passing between them like an old prayer. Clara took a hesitant step forward. "You brought them here?" Eli shook his head. "No. The kind of men I used to ride with don't need an invitation when there's wrong to be righted. We were never preachers or saints, Miss Harland, but we had a code, help those who can't stand alone." She looked from him to the group, their weathered faces and quiet eyes. They didn't look like heroes, but something about them, the stillness, the certainty, made her chest tighten. The grey-haired man adjusted his hat. "You Harland's girl?" "Yes." He nodded slowly. "Heard your father was a proud man. Pride's a heavy saddle. Sometimes it breaks the horse beneath it. But you—" His eyes softened. "You got your mother's fire, I reckon." Clara didn't answer, but her throat burned. Eli stepped forward. "These men won't stay long. They'll help rebuild, watch the ridges, keep word out for Maddox's gang, but once it's done, they'll ride on." "And you?" she asked quietly. "I'll stay till the job's finished," he said. "Then the wind can decide." For the first time since the attack, something like hope flickered in Clara's chest. Small, fragile, but alive. The sight of those riders, calm and steady against the ruins of her home, felt like the first breath after nearly drowning. Samuel Harland, weak but awake, watched from the window upstairs. His voice cracked as he whispered to himself, "Maybe God sends angels in dusters now." Outside, the cowboys unsaddled their horses and began mending the broken fences without being told. No boasts, no talk, just the quiet rhythm of men doing what must be done. And as the hammering echoed across the valley, Clara stood at the porch rail, her fingers trembling on the wood. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel alone. The winds shifted again, carrying the promise of reckoning. Somewhere out there, Maddox's gang was regrouping, and this time Redstone Valley wouldn't be easy prey. The next days rolled by with the slow patience of men who understood that revenge required more than rage. It required readiness. The valley that had burned with smoke now rang with the sounds of rebuilding. Hammers, saws, low murmurs, and the steady rhythm of horses moving fence posts. Eli Mercer worked alongside the Harland hands, though his silence set him apart. He wasn't a man who wasted words, but when he did speak, people listened. The others, the grey-haired leader named Jonas Tate, a tracker called Lyle, a Mexican sharpshooter everyone just called Rico, and 3 younger drifters who owed Eli their lives, followed his lead without question. They called themselves nothing. They didn't need to. Clara watched them from the porch most mornings, her coffee cooling untouched. She'd never seen men like them. No swagger, no need to prove a thing. They moved with the quiet discipline of those who'd seen too many graves. The way they rebuilt the corral, trained the horses, cleaned the burned fields, it wasn't just labor. It was ritual, the kind that healed more than fences. Eli noticed her watching. One evening, when the last boards were nailed and the sky bled orange over the ridge, he walked up the steps. "You should rest," he said. "You've been staring holes through us since dawn." Clara folded her arms. "I don't rest easy when the men who tried to kill my father are still out there." He nodded. "Then maybe you should learn what to do when they come back." That night, under the broad blue wash of moonlight, Eli laid out rifles on the porch table, old scarred weapons with more stories than bullets left in them. "First thing," he said, handing her a revolver, "is that a gun's not for pride, it's for last chances." Clara hesitated before taking it. The metal was cold, heavier than she expected. "I'm not afraid to fight." "I know," Eli said, checking the chamber, "but fear ain't the same as readiness. You fight angry, you die quick." The others trained her over the next few days, how to aim, how to breathe, how to listen. Jonas taught her how to spot a man's intent before his hand even twitched. Rico showed her how to move through the trees without breaking twigs. Lyle explained how to read the earth, a broken blade of grass, a shifted stone, the faint smell of tobacco in still air. It wasn't just Clara who learned. The ranch hands watched and followed, quietly turning fear into muscle. The Harland Ranch was no longer just land and livestock. It was a fortress. But between drills and dust, something else began to shift in Clara. One evening, she found Eli sitting near the creek, sharpening his knife beneath the stars. She sat beside him without asking. The moon rippled on the water like a memory neither of them could hold still. "Why'd you really come here?" she asked. He didn't look up. "A man I once called brother made me promise something before he died. Said if I ever heard his name tied to the Harlands, I'd make it right." "Royce Maddox." Eli nodded once. "We rode together years ago. He saved my life in a canyon ambush. I thought he'd changed. But greed has a way of rotting a man from the inside. When I left his gang, he swore I'd regret it. Guess he kept his word." Clara studied his face, the calm lines carved by time and regret. "And now you're here to pay for his sins." "I'm here to stop his ghost from hurting anyone else." The air between them was heavy, but not uncomfortable. Clara looked down at her reflection in the water, the soot still faint on her skin, the exhaustion around her eyes. "You think I can do it? Stand against them?" Eli turned to her, voice steady as the current. "You already have. The hardest fight's the one that happens before the first shot's fired." In the distance, thunder rolled, but it wasn't weather. Rico looked up from the barn roof. "Riders," he said quietly. 5, maybe 6, coming from the south. The valley froze. The men reached for rifles. Horses snorted. Boots scuffed against the dirt. Eli stood, gaze locked on the horizon. "They're scouts," he muttered, "testing our nerve." Clara's heartbeat matched the rumble. She felt no fear now, only a sharp electric clarity. Eli adjusted his hat. "Let 'em come close," he said. "It's time they learned Redstone Valley ain't theirs to burn." The men fanned out into the growing darkness, the air trembling with tension. Clara checked the revolver in her hand, not for pride this time, but for purpose. Somewhere beyond the ridge, the bandits' laughter carried faintly through the wind. The storm was coming again, but this time it would find the valley waiting. The night fell hard and silent over Redstone Valley. The air was thick, charged, and humming with that strange kind of quiet that only comes before violence. Every man on the ranch could feel it. Even the wind seemed to be holding its breath. Eli Mercer stood near the barn, his eyes tracing the tree line under the pale wash of moonlight. He could smell them before he saw them, the faint sting of whiskey, the sweat of horses that had been ridden too fast, too far. Maddox's men had come back, and this time they weren't here to send a message. They were here to finish the job. Clara crouched beside him, the revolver steady in her hands. Her pulse raced, but her breathing was even, just like Eli had taught her. "How many?" she whispered. "6," Eli replied, eyes never leaving the shadows. "But if Maddox is smart, he's waiting behind them." Down the slope, torches flickered to life. 6 riders spread out, their laughter carried by the wind. One of them shouted, "Come on out, Harland! We've come to collect what's owed!" No one answered. Jonas and the others were hidden in the barn loft, rifles trained. Rico crouched behind the stone well, his Winchester gleaming faintly in the moonlight. Every exit, every fence line, every patch of open ground had been chosen carefully. Eli's hand rested lightly on Clara's shoulder. "Whatever happens," he said, "don't shoot unless you have to. Mercy ain't weakness. It's proof we're still better than them." But Clara's eyes were already fixed on the lead rider, the man who had shot her father. She recognized his voice, that cruel rasp that still haunted her dreams. "He doesn't deserve mercy," she muttered. Eli didn't argue. He only said, "Then make sure you don't miss." The first shot came not from them, but from Maddox's men. A muzzle flash tore open the dark, the bullet shattering a lantern by the barn door. The sudden burst of light illuminated the scene like a painting of war. Shadows, smoke and fire. Eli fired back once, clean and calm. A rider toppled from his horse before the echo faded. The others scattered, firing wildly. The ranch exploded with sound, wood splintering, horses screaming, men shouting through the smoke. Clara moved like she'd been born for it, low, precise, fearless. She ducked behind a trough, returned fire, and saw one of the bandits drop his gun and flee into the dark. Her hands trembled, but not from fear. It was something sharper, justice, or maybe the weight of finally acting. Rico's rifle cracked again and again, each shot measured and deadly. Jonas barked orders from the barn loft, calling targets like a commander who'd seen too many nights like this. The younger drifters moved between the corrals, cutting off escape routes, tightening the noose around the intruders. And then the last torchlight parted, and a figure stepped forward, tall, heavy-set, with a scar twisting his smile, Royce Maddox. His horse snorted as he dismounted, shotgun resting on one shoulder. "Mercer," he called out, "I figured it was you meddling in my business." Always had a hero complex. Eli stepped from the shadows, rifle lowered but ready. "Wasn't hero work that brought me here, Royce, just an old promise." Maddox chuckled. "Ain't you tired of keeping promises for dead men?" "Maybe," Eli said, his voice steady, "but I aim to keep this one anyway." The standoff hung between them like a drawn blade. The wind hissed through the burned grass. Somewhere a horse whinnied, restless. Then Maddox leveled the shotgun and fired. The blast caught Eli's shoulder, spinning him back. Clara screamed, running toward him. Maddox pumped another shell, grinning. "Told you once, Mercer, pride'll get you killed." Before he could pull the trigger again, Clara stepped into the open, revolver raised. Her voice cut through the smoke. "You burned our home. You shot my father. And you think pride's the sin here?" Maddox turned toward her, mocking smile curling wider. "Look at that." The kitten grew claws. He never saw the flash until it hit him. Clara's bullet struck clean just below the collarbone. Maddox staggered, dropped his gun, and collapsed into the dirt with a sound like the air leaving the world. The silence that followed was brutal. Only the crackle of dying fire filled it. Eli, bleeding but alive, managed a faint smile as Clara knelt beside him. "You did what had to be done," he said softly. Tears streaked her soot-stained cheeks. "I wasn't supposed to kill him." Eli looked at her hand, still trembling around the revolver. "You didn't. You ended what he started." The last of Maddox's men fled into the night, their torches swallowed by darkness. The valley was still again, the stars sharp and cold above the smoke. And for the first time since the fire, the ranch stood unbroken, not by wealth, not by pride, but by courage, and a kind of love that didn't need words to be understood. The dawn after the gunfire came quiet, the kind of quiet that felt almost sacred. The smoke had thinned, drifting lazily over the blackened fields, and the earth itself seemed to exhale after holding its breath all night. The windmill turned slow again, creaking like an old hymn. For the first time in weeks, Redstone Valley smelled not of ash, but of morning. Eli Mercer sat on the porch steps, his left arm bound in a rough sling, blood already drying into the bandage. Jonas and the others had done what they could. The wound would heal, though the scar would stay, another mark in a life already written in them. Clara stepped outside with a basin of water and a clean cloth. She knelt beside him without a word and began wiping the dust and blood from his face. Her movements were careful, steady, not the wild girl the valley whispered about. Not any more. "You should rest," Eli murmured. She shook her head. "So should you." Behind them, the cowboys moved through the ranch like quiet ghosts, putting things back where they belonged. Jonas and Lyle were repairing the barn door. Rico was burying the bodies far beyond the pasture fence. No trophies, no celebration, just the respect due to any man who met his end under the open sky. When Clara finished tending Eli's wounds, she sat beside him, elbows on her knees. "It's strange," she said softly. "I thought I'd feel peace, but it's more like emptiness." "That's how peace feels sometimes," Eli replied. "Like the noise finally stopped and you don't know what to do without it." She looked at him then, eyes catching the first light of the sun. "You think it's over?" "For now," he said. "Men like Maddox always leave shadows behind them, but those shadows fade when you stop feeding them with fear." Clara's gaze drifted toward the hills, where Maddox's gang had vanished. "He used to scare me," she admitted. "Not because of what he did, but because he made me see what hate can turn a person into. I never want to be that." Eli smiled faintly. "Then you won't." The door opened behind them. Samuel Harland, pale but upright, stepped out onto the porch. His right arm was still in a sling, but his eyes were clearer than they'd been in years. He looked at his daughter, really looked at her, and for once saw not defiance, but strength. "You did what I couldn't," he said quietly. "You protected this land, and me when I was too proud to ask for help." Clara rose, swallowing hard. "You taught me pride, Father." "I taught you the wrong kind," he said, voice rough. "Yours saved us." He turned to Eli, extending his good hand. "And you? I owe you more than I can pay." Eli shook his head. "You don't owe me. A promise brought me here. It's been kept." Jonas walked over then, hat in hand. "We'll ride out at first light," he said. "Rico's buried the dead. The ranch'll be safe enough now." Clara's eyes widened. "You're leaving?" Eli nodded. "Ain't our place to stay where peace is already won?" She took a small step closer. "And you? Where will you go?" Eli looked toward the horizon, a golden line cutting through the mist. "Wherever the wind remembers my name," he said. Something unspoken passed between them. Gratitude, sadness, something more fragile than love, but deeper. Jonas mounted his horse, the others following in silence. When Eli finally swung into his saddle, Clara stood by the gate, her hands clasped tight. "You came here a stranger," she said. "Now this place will always remember you." Eli tipped his hat. "I reckon that's enough for any man." He turned his horse toward the rising sun. The others followed, their silhouettes fading into the golden dust until only the echo of hoofbeats remained. Clara stood there long after they were gone. The valley stretched before her, scarred yet alive. She breathed in the morning air, sharp, clean, full of promise. Behind her, Samuel's voice drifted through the open door. "Clara, breakfast's on the table." She smiled faintly. "Coming." But before she went inside, she turned once more toward the horizon. "Thank you, Cowboy," she whispered, her voice carried by the wind. And in that wind, in the faint whisper that rustled the dry grass, it almost sounded like a reply. "You're welcome, miss." Weeks passed, and the valley began to heal in its quiet way. The rains came early that season, softening the scorched earth and washing away the black scars that had once marked the attack. Grass pushed through the ash, green and stubborn. The fences stood straight again, the barns smelled of new hay, and laughter, cautious at first, began to return to the Harland ranch. But Eli Mercer was gone. Some mornings, Clara still caught herself glancing toward the ridge, half expecting to see the black horse waiting there, its rider motionless against the sky. Other days, when the wind rattled the windows just right, she could almost hear his voice again. Low, steady, the kind that carried calm even through a storm. His departure had been like everything else about him, quiet, without ceremony. The morning after the cowboys rode out, Clara had found the music box her mother once owned, resting on the porch rail, freshly polished, the broken hinge repaired. Beside it, a single horseshoe, Eli's mark, left as both a farewell and a promise that some things, once fixed, stay fixed. She kept that music box by her window now. Every night she wound it once before bed, letting the soft tune spill through the house like a memory made of sound. It no longer made her ache, it made her remember. In town, people still spoke of the night the Harland ranch burned. Some said Samuel Harland had struck a deal with angels. Others whispered that the devil himself had sent cowboys to even the score. But those who worked the land, those who knew the smell of gunpowder and sweat, told it straight. A stranger rode in and stood his ground where no one else would. Over time, the legend grew. They said the cowboy had eyes that could see a lie before it was spoken, and that his rifle never missed, not because of skill, but because he never shot without reason. They said he carried the ghosts of his past like saints carried rosaries, counting them, learning from them, never letting them fade. And Clara, she became part of that legend too. Folks no longer called her wild or unruly. They called her the woman who stood her ground. When ranch hands passed her on the road, they tipped their hats not out of duty, but out of respect. The same sheriff who once warned her about her temper now sent deputies to her land for advice on handling disputes. Samuel Harland, slower but wiser, had learned to let his daughter's fire guide the ranch, not fear it. At night, when the lamps went low and the valley turned silver under the moon, Clara would ride out alone. She always took Vesper, her mother's mare, following the trail Eli's horse had carved when he left. Sometimes she'd stop at the ridge where he first appeared that evening long ago, the place where dusk met dust, and sit in silence. One night, she found something there, a small carved token in the shape of a cross, smoothed by weather and time. She turned it over in her palm, realizing it must have been his. It wasn't much. But to her, it was proof that legends didn't just vanish. They left pieces behind for those willing to look. As the moon climbed higher, she whispered into the wind, "Wherever you are, I hope you found peace." The wind, gentle and warm, moved through the tall grass like an answer, not in words, but in feeling. Down in town, stories of the Harland girl and the lone cowboy spread farther than the valley. Drifters repeated them in saloons from Kansas to New Mexico. Each retelling changed the details. Sometimes she was a widow, sometimes he was an outlaw turned saint. But the heart of it stayed the same. Two souls broken by pride and pain, finding redemption not in riches, but in doing what was right when it mattered most. Years later, travelers passing through Redstone still spoke of the ranch where courage once burned brighter than any fire, and where a woman learned that even the wildest spirit could be tempered not by force, but by love, sacrifice, and the echo of a cowboy's promise. And on some rare nights when the sky went gold before dawn, old ranch hands swore they could see him again, a lone figure riding the horizon, coat flapping in the wind, heading toward the light. Years later, when folks looked back on the story of the Harland Ranch, they didn't talk first about the fire or the gunfight or the blood spilled beneath the cottonwoods. They spoke of something rarer, the kind of courage that doesn't roar, but stands quietly when standing is all that's left to do. They spoke of Clara Harland, the untamable daughter who learned that strength isn't found in breaking rules, but in knowing which ones are worth keeping. They spoke of Eli Mercer, The wanderer who carried too many ghosts to ever stay long, but who still chose to stop when someone needed him most. The valley itself seemed to remember them. Seasons turned, the grass grew tall again, and the ranch prospered. But at dusk, when the sun bled orange across the plains, the wind carried whispers through the fence lines, faint stories of fire and forgiveness, of a cowboy who came from nowhere and left behind something more powerful than bullets: redemption. Clara grew older, though her spirit never dulled. She married a ranch hand years later, a kind man named Caleb, who understood that he was sharing her heart with a memory. Together they rebuilt the Harlan name into something honorable again, not built on wealth or pride, but on work, mercy, and the courage to protect what was right. Sometimes, when their children asked about the scar on her arm or the pistol she kept in the drawer, Clara would smile faintly and say, "That's a story about how one man reminded me that not every stranger comes to take. Some come to give back what the world stole." She never said his name. She didn't need to. In the valley, names fade, but deeds endure. Years turn to decades. The townsfolk came and went, and the world around Redstone Valley changed. Railroads, telegraph lines, new laws, new wars. But still, at the heart of that wide country, there remained a story carved into the land itself, that one night, when greed tried to burn everything decent, courage and compassion answered on horseback. And sometimes, just sometimes, when a traveler rode past the old Harlan place at twilight, he'd see a woman standing by the fence, her hair silver under the fading sun, looking toward the ridge where the wind still sang through the grass. If he looked long enough, he might swear he saw two silhouettes there, one standing still, one on horseback, both outlined against the horizon like a memory the world refused to forget. Because stories like that don't die. They live on in the silence between gunshots, in the creak of a saddle, in the soft voice that says, you can still choose what kind of person you'll be. And maybe that's the lesson the Old West keeps teaching, that redemption isn't found in gold or glory, but in the quiet act of doing right when no one's watching, that the loneliest rider can still bring hope, and the most stubborn heart can still find peace. So if you've ever lost faith in people, if you've ever thought kindness was a weakness or that good men don't exist anymore, remember this story. Remember Redstone Valley. Remember the girl who stood her ground and the cowboy who kept his word. Because somewhere out there, under another sky, there's always someone like Eli Mercer. Still riding, still keeping promises, still proving that decency doesn't die with time. If this story stirred something in you, a memory, a lesson, a spark of hope, leave a comment below and tell me what it made you feel. If you believe that stories of justice, redemption, and quiet courage still matter, share this video so others can remember too. And if you want to keep traveling these dusty roads with me, where hearts heal, heroes rise, and legends never truly fade, subscribe and stay for the next story. Because out here, in the old frontier of the soul, every ending is just another beginning, waiting for the sound of hooves in the distance.